The cover page for chapter 1097, while at first is seemingly just a nice and relaxing snapshot of the time that Ginny and Kuma spent together in the Sorbet Kingdom, might in reality end up being one of the most somber cover pages we've had in a very long time. Because we get this nice little moment of the two enjoying themselves, with Kuma using his powers to catch some fish, and Ginny popping them on the grill for the two of them and their two friends who are cheering Kuma on in the background, who, by the way, look to be the same two boys Ginny beat up in the previous chapter for bullying Kuma, who, as many have already pointed out, go on later in life to become members of Bonnie's pirate crew. Surprisingly enough, these two show up again later on in the chapter, and actually keep them in mind because they actually might hold the key to answering a very important question that everyone has about Bonnie after reading this chapter. Anyway, getting back to the whole somber thing, this cover page, while very wholesome, is more than likely one of the very few moments of true peace Kuma had in his entire life. As we find out in the very beginning of the chapter, Kuma, like many assumed he would, spent a majority of his time using his powers to help relieve the pain and suffering of those who lived in the boonies of the kingdom. And then, very self-sacrificingly, each day would go on to absorb all the pain into himself, basically having his own nothing happen on a daily basis. And the reason why he absorbed the pain is because if he didn't, then eventually the pain would just return to its original owner. All while Ginny could do nothing but silently watch his daily ritual and then nurse him back to health immediately afterwards. And we can see in this chapter that seeing him do this over and over again was killing her inside, because to her, Kuma was this big, goofy guy who she grew to fall in love with, who was so kind that he was willing to take on the pain of others without asking for anything in return. And to her, someone like him deserved all the happiness in the world, which is why she, a few years later, is insisting that the two of them get married, so that she can go on to give him a family, and that they can be one small glimmer of peace and happiness in this otherwise hellish life. But the one thing that Ginny didn't understand was that even though the pain was intense, taking it into himself was actually something that made Kuma happy, because it meant he was helping others. As we see, even when suffering from the after effects, he's still smiling from ear to ear. You know, funny enough, or actually I guess more sad than funny, the one thing that probably would have made Kuma the unhappiest at this time was actually marrying Ginny. Not because he didn't love her, I'm pretty sure he did. In fact, I think later on in the chapter we confirm it, but because he was still basically traumatized by what happened to his parents. More specifically, his mom, who, despite not having any Buccaneer blood in her, suffered the same consequences as him and his dad, simply for being a part of their family. That is the last thing that someone as kind-hearted as Kuma would ever want to see happen to another person, let alone someone he cares so much for. So he continued to dance around the question, obviously wanting to say yes, but fearing the consequences for her if he did. But despite that, it seems like Ginny doesn't give up on her pursuit of our Holy Bear Man, as we see much later in life after the two join the Revolutionary Army, her beaming with excitement over being able to reunite with him again after some time apart, as the two have both gone on to become captains of their own divisions in the army, with her being the captain of the Eastern Division. We don't find out what division Kuma was in charge of in this chapter, and to the best of my research, aka checking his wiki page, it was never mentioned prior to this chapter, but if it was and someone out there knows, please let me know down in the comments. And speaking of the revolutionaries, we get to see a young dragon in this chapter. I say young, but he's more like in his early to mid 30s the first time we see him in this chapter, and despite leading the charge to heroically save Kuma and the rest of Sorbet Kingdom from the cruelty of their king, we don't actually get to see him in action. So still no confirmation on any of the theories on how powerful Dragon actually is, but we do get confirmation on one of the big theories surrounding the character, as we find out in this chapter that yes, Dragon at one point was a Marine, and given him being the same age as Sakazuki, it's more than likely that the two enlisted around the same time. In fact, they were probably cadets together, and possibly had a similar relationship to Kobe and Helmeppo back in the day. And Dragon leaving the Marines and going on to become the world's most wanted criminal is more than likely the betrayal that gave old Lava Breath his intense hatred for Dragon, and why he was so dead set on killing Luffy after finding out he was Dragon's son. We also see that when he first met Kuma, Dragon didn't have his iconic tattoo, which, growing up watching and reading One Piece, I always assumed that was actually a brand and not a tattoo. But regardless of which it is, we can see in this chapter that he doesn't have it in the beginning of the flashback, but later on he does have it, which takes place about 8 years later. So I wonder, what happened in those 8 years that caused Dragon to get that tattoo? Oh, and by the by, while we're still on Dragon-based theories, I hope that this chapter can finally put to bed the theory that Ginny is in fact Luffy's mom. Because again, as we can clearly see at the end of the chapter, Ginny is very much still head over heels in love with Kuma, so it's very unlikely that she has settled, yes I said settled, for giving up on her bear man in order to pursue her own boss. And that's not to say that Dragon didn't care for Ginny, he clearly did, as we can see at the end of the chapter when he gets the news that she's been captured. I'm just saying that it is very unlikely based on what we've been seeing from this flashback that the two of them were ever romantically involved. And now that we're on to Ginny's kidnapping, this is very likely the moment that we've all been dreading to happen. This is the moment where we more than likely are going to find out how Ginny ends up dying. But there is some hope that we might still be at least a bit off from that event, as even now, with the flashback being only 14 years prior to the current story, we still not heard or seen anything about Bonnie. So if Bonnie truly is a biological daughter of both Kuma and Jenny, then there is still some time before the inevitable happens. And though it is worth pointing out, if Bonnie hasn't already been born, then that would mean that at most she's around 12 to 13 years old in the present day. So the theory about her being a literal child might actually be true. Or I guess I should say preteens. I know from my younger cousins that about around that age, they hate being referred to as still children and would prefer to be called preteens. So yeah, we'll call her preteen Bonnie instead of kid Bonnie. Or it could be that Bonnie was actually just a child that they, or maybe just Kuma, found one day and decided to take in, which means that she could still be around the 19 to 21-year-old age that we usually see her as. And that would actually make much more sense why she looks so tattered as a kid in that one drawing that Oda drew of her from her childhood. But it is worth pointing out that I believe that drawing is something from an SBS and not an actual chapter from the manga, so we can't really give it too much weight as being a true depiction of her childhood, simply because between when he drew that picture and today, he could have changed his mind on exactly how he wanted to play out Bonnie's origin story. And then, of course, there's a third option, where it could be that Ginny already gave birth to Bonnie and we just don't see her in this chapter. Perhaps while the two are all fulfilling their captainly duties, she is actually being looked after by the kind folk in the Sorbet Kingdom, finally paying back all the years Kuma selflessly helped ease their pain. And actually, this could explain why we see Kuma near the end of the chapter going back to Sorbet Kingdom. Perhaps he was going there to actually see his daughter again. And actually, if we rewind all the way back to the beginning of this video, this is why I told you to keep Kuma's two former bullies in mind, because it could very well be that the two of them took responsibility for looking after Bonnie while both Kuma and Ginny were off on missions. And as the years went on, it went from them simply babysitting their friend's kid to them being forced to join our pirate crew because much like Garp couldn't stop Luffy, they couldn't stop her from setting sail to become a pirate. And you know what? That actually makes what eventually ends up happening to her crew even sadder, because this means that when she was escaping from the world government, Bonnie was forced to leave behind two people who had actually raised her. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but I will mention that there actually is a fourth option, that Bonnie could be Ginny's clone. Personally, I think we had enough clones introduced and confirmed in this arc alone that we don't really need anymore, but it is still a viable option given Kuma's relationship to Vegapunk. And finally, there's still one very big question that needs to be answered from this chapter. Who captured Ginny? And the only clue we have is a silhouetted foot that appears at the very end of the chapter, which obviously is not much to go on. However, I think it's pretty obvious who this will end up being, good old Saint Saturn himself, simply because it makes the most sense narratively, with him already being positioned as the big bad of the arc in the present day with Bonnie, and the one who tried to stop Kuma from freeing the slaves at God Valley. It makes sense for Oda to want to complete the trifecta by having him be responsible for capturing Ginny, which is obviously going to lead to a second confrontation between himself and Kuma, and more than likely, whatever the results of that fight are, is more than likely going to lead to Kuma making this deal with the world government, possibly to protect Ginny, but most likely to protect Bonnie. Oh, and to add a little bit more evidence to the theory that it's going to be Saturn who ended up capturing Ginny, this could be the reason why Bonnie decided to attack him on sight when he first showed up on Egghead, because she has the memories of Kuma and knows what he possibly did to her mother, either just capturing her or potentially also killing her as well. But hey, that's just my theory. Let me know in the comments down below who you believe it was that actually managed to capture Ginny.